This panel is going to go into more detail in a subject that you heard mentioned during our first panel, which is social impact bonds. A quite new and very creative technique for financing social enterprise. And we have an exceptional panel who have approached this from a number of different perspectives. Ryan Gillette is Assistant Director at the Harvard Social Impact Bond Technical Assistance Lab, and in his capacity there, he's helped the Chicago Mayor's Office launch the largest city-level social impact bond in the country, which was designed to increase access to high-quality preschool, a subject that is near and dear to the heart of our mayor and folks concerned with education here in New York. David Gorlick is an associate in the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs, where he's an acquisition team member focused on social innovation financing and mixed income and mixed use real estate projects. Then we have Leah Schuster, who is with Third Sector Capital Partners. Third Sector is a not-for-profit issuer a not-for-profit which aims at accelerating America's transition to a performance-driven sector, and she works on deal construction support to government, nonprofit, and philanthropic clients. And then our moderator is Peter Olberg, my colleague at the law firm of Manat, Phelps & Phillips. Peter's practice focuses on community development and healthcare transactions, and I can say from my long association with him that he exemplifies a couple of terms that don't necessarily spring to mind when people think of lawyers: creative, innovative, and focused on making things happen. So Peter, welcome, and please proceed.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you to Dean Allard and to Liz Alper for hosting us. And Paul, thank you to you and the Center for Urban Business Entrepreneurship for inviting us to participate in this discussion of this very important subject. We do have a really terrific panel for you today. As Paul mentioned, Ryan is with the Harvard SIB Lab, which is the leading policy and advisory group in the country, I believe, on social impact bonds. Leah's firm, Third Sector Capital, has been engaged in actually making SIBs happen and can offer some very helpful perspectives. And David is with the Goldman Sachs Urban Investment Group, which I believe is the leading SIB investor in the country. So I think we'll have very interesting discussion. We're going to ask each panelist to present a unique perspective. We're going to ask, in addition to talking about what their groups do and some of their experiences in social impact bonds, we'll ask Ryan to speak about the perspective of government. We'll ask Leah to speak about the perspective of the not-for-profit project manager, and we'll ask David to talk about the perspective of the investor. I will end by talking a little bit about the perspective of a not-for-profit financing participant, and since we're at the law school, I'll mention a few selected legal topics at the end. So we can have our slide. We have one slide for the entire presentation, so we won't overslide you. The slide that we're going to put up is designed to just introduce a little bit about the basic structure of social impact bonds that have been, that we on this panel have participated in putting together and closing. As you know, the basic concept of a SIB is that is to harness private market capital, for-profit capital, to finance a social program that government has identified as a cost-saving program. but the government does not have the means to finance itself. And government agrees to share the savings of the success of the program with the investor. And the investor agrees to take the risk that the social program will not be successful. So clearly the starting point is a government or entity, government agency that's identified a need, and that, a need that it believes will have a measurable impact on the cost incurred by government. And the concept of reducing recidivism is probably the best known example because recidivism is such a difficult problem, and it is tangible savings can be enjoyed by government if recidivism is reduced. So up in the upper right, on the right-hand side of our chart, we have the government agency, and right above it, we have the program provider. We need to have a social program provider that is experienced and has a demonstrated track record in implementing the social program and producing tangible results. Then in the middle of the chart, we have a project manager. This would be the organization that Leah's firm often plays the role of. The project manager aggregates capital, implements the program, and administers the measurement of the success of the program. And down below the project manager, we have the program evaluator, the organization that measures the impact of the program to determine whether pay-for-success payments are due. And at the left, we have the senior lender and a subordinate lender or credit enhancer who provide the capital for the program. And if the program is successful, then back to the right-hand side of the chart, the government agency agrees to make pay-for-success payments to the project manager, who in turn uses them to repay the financing provided by the senior lender and the subordinate lender. So with that brief introduction and hopefully a little vocabulary for us all, I think we'd like to begin by asking Ryan to talk a little bit about his experience and in particular the perspective of government, and I'll ask each of the panelists in the course of their presentation to try to address what characteristics make for a successful social impact bond program, and what can we do to encourage more SIBs to be actually completed and put into action. Ryan?
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Hello? Yes. So thank you, Peter, for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting us to come. This is obviously a very interesting topic to all of us because it's what we do all day, and always happy to talk about it. So I work with this organization called the Harvard Kennedy School Social Impact Bond Technical Assistance Lab, which is a name that we are shortening in the near future. And what our role is to provide pro bono technical assistance to governments that are interested in putting together these social impact bond pay-for-success style transactions. When this market was sort of first getting started, we found that there were a lot of skills gaps in government that needed to be filled. And we thought that the only way that we were ever going to be able to get one of these done would be if there was an outside resource that could come in and help government think about some of these challenges in ways that maybe they're not used to doing, and B, making sure that they actually had the on-the-ground capacity to do this. What we found with these projects is that they typically are relatively complex and they take some time to put together. And if we don't have someone who is on the ground thinking about this every day, making sure the project is continuing to move forward, it's really easy to lose momentum and have these projects die out. So over the last 3 years, we have worked with 8 states and 2 cities. We'll try to name all of them, but I'll probably forget them. And we have been involved with 4 of the 7 pay-for-success transactions that are currently up and operational in the country. So as part of our role, we get to spend a lot of time working with governments. Our model involves embedding people within governments that are trying to do this and having someone that sits there on a day-to-day basis. So we really do get to get some good insights into what government is looking for when they're trying to put together these deals. So what we've found from the government's perspective, what will typically make a government successful at being able to do one of these is, first of all, there has to be top senior level buy-in. Because these deals are complex, we need to make sure that the top policymakers are involved and are excited about doing this. Similar to that, we want to make sure that if a government is interested in doing this, that they are focused on a policy area that is a top priority for the administration. Because these things take a lot of time to do, you want to make sure that this is something that whether it be a governor or a mayor or a county executive, that this is a big issue that they're trying to tackle, and B, something that they are maybe not making great progress on currently, and they want to make sure that they can improve the outcomes for people. On a more technical level, there are a couple things we look for. One, potential for savings. So, you know, as Peter sort of briefly described, the general idea behind this is that we're trying to say, look, if we make a preventative investment, that can result in government savings down the line from not having to pay for last-ditch remediation services. So recidivism is the classic example of this. If you can design a program that keeps people from going to jail in the first place, then you don't have to pay for the cost of incarcerating them, you know, 3 years down the road. And you can use those savings that you get if you design a rigorous evaluation to actually estimate what you think your program did. You can use those savings to then potentially repay a set of lenders who provided the working capital up front. So first of all, you have to have savings, but then second of all, you have to have outcomes. So in particular, you need to be focusing on a policy area where there are outcomes that you can actually measure. Sometimes that can be hard. So you know, picking a policy area where the outcome is something that is quantifiable, achievable, and measurable given government data systems, which is a separate issue that we can talk about later. But you know, government tracks a lot of things, but they don't always track them in a super usable format. I know in a past program I saw a government that was keeping track of homeless shelter entries by writing it down on napkins. So that can be a little bit tricky when you're trying to determine whether or not your program is having an impact. And then sort of lastly, you want to focus maybe on something that's not too high of a political risk. You know, since these are long-term initiatives that oftentimes could last beyond a current administration, you don't want to design a project that's very specific to a given administration's priorities such that down the road, if a new administration comes in, they want to completely abandon it. We haven't seen anything like that come up so far, but it's something to be aware of. Briefly on how I think we could get more of these done with government, and then I'll let other people share their insights on this too. I think there are a few things that I've seen in our work so far. One is just government capacity. You know, there's always a million things going on in government. Government is always probably has fewer people than they need to be doing all the things that they already do. So it's hard for them to spend time focusing on a long-term initiative that takes a lot of brain power to think about. On that note, I think the way the current deals are structured is there's actually a pretty high complexity to size of deal ratio in that these deals take a lot to put together, and at the end of the day, you're putting together a $15 million deal, a $20 million deal. If government wanted to do this by themselves and spend spend their own time and their own resources doing this, for that to really be worth their time, it would be great if they could be doing this with $100 million or $200 million, so that it's really worth the investment of time and energy. Luckily, you know, as this market has been starting to get started, there have been a lot of foundations and other people out there who have been willing to provide pro bono support for, or philanthropic support for organizations like the SIB Lab and Third Sector and Social Finance, which is another organization that does this, to provide assistance to governments so that they can get the assistance they need to get these projects off the ground. And then the last thing I'll say is just, I think from the government's perspective, we really need to see if we can get the federal government more involved with these. A lot of these projects involve deals in which there are the potential for big federal savings, but potentially not as many state or county or city savings. So the place where you see this the most is with projects that generate Medicaid savings. So typically in most states, there's a 50-50 state-federal split, which means that if you design a project that avoids $10,000 worth of Medicaid expenditures, the state only realizes half of that. And the rest of it goes to the feds, who sit there and say, great, thanks for putting this together, we'll just pocket that money. So if there was a way to unlock those federal savings, then it would make a lot of deals a lot easier to put together. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you very much, Ryan. Leah, can you tell us about the project manager's role and what your thoughts are?
Absolutely. So, hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I work at a firm called Third Sector Capital Partners. We and another firm that Ryan mentioned, Social Finance US, are the two transaction coordinators in the United States. We do a myriad of roles. We help support governments and the SIB Lab when the deal is ready for transactional investment. We also do project programmatic management. So once we actually procure a service provider through competitive procurement, once we engage the academic evaluator to figure out how they will measure success over the term of the project, and once we actually close all of the financing and according legal documents, we then launch the project. A lot of these projects have a pretty long tenor, anywhere between 3 to 5 years. And a lot of that tenor or duration is dependent on how long it takes for a rigorous statistical evaluation to say with statistical significance that you actually achieved impact. And that the intervention that you finance is the reason for that impact, not other variables. So as a result, there's an enormous importance on governance and operational oversight over the entire project. For one, we are riding a lot of legal and financial risk on the project. It's not like you're giving a grant and whether or not it succeeds, you never see that money back. You have a potential, investors have a potential to see that money back. So as a result, they received quarterly reports on how the project is doing, how close we are to certain metrics that have been predetermined. And I think what the field is learning increasingly is what tweaks may there need to be in order that we didn't anticipate during contracting. So the programmatic manager is sort of the connective tissue between the investors, the government back-end payer, the service provider who's actually implementing the impact, and the academic evaluator, using the contractual agreements that underpin the entire organism to make sure that we are doing what we set out to do when we put the contracts together. A big part of that that we've learned is to actually create two types of oversight committees. One is operational in nature, so focused on the actual provision of services to the target populations. These, in a homeless project, this would include the homeless agency, this would include supportive services, this would include maybe the court system, and of course the relevant government representatives who are in charge of policy related to the agency. That committee potentially meets twice a month to make sure that, to track the population referrals, to track measures of success, and most importantly, to highlight anything that's been unanticipated that would impact the loans that we took out. The second piece is more high level. It's called the governance committee, and that would include more the C-level structure of the provider, the decision makers, the senior level government that has bought in, and anyone that is necessary to help us amend the contract if that is necessary. And to answer some of Peter's questions in terms of what makes a good SIB, Ryan, you took a lot of the great answers, so I was scribbling, trying to come up with something else. But I think, so when we first started putting these projects together, we really thought a lot about the senior level buy-in. How do you have someone who can harness the energy to take what's a 4-year-old concept in this country to get it up the chains and get it on the political agenda of someone who can make a decision. That's really important at first. But during implementation, when things get messed up, and they do, because as Ryan said, these are very complicated, and we probably have overcomplicated the first 7 deals that we've put together, you need broad-based buy-in. So you need the buy-in of the council and legislative body. You need the buy-in of the fiscal officer. You need the buy-in of the agency heads so that their staff, who have to be newly trained, know what's going on. That's something that we've started to learn the last year or two as we've actually implemented deals. Another piece that's undeniably important is trackable data. And Ryan mentioned this too. A big reason that recidivism started as a popular deal to construct is because recidivism data, unlike many other types of social data systems, looks very similar from city to city and across the country. And people can understand recidivism data. There aren't as many complicated trackers as there might be in something like foster care, or something that hits federal systems, or something that hits dual involved systems. Having access to that data pretty promptly is very important. What we found is that a data system exists. Maybe your evaluator doesn't have a data sharing agreement that enables you to actually see what's in that data. Maybe it's difficult to actually integrate that data. Oftentimes that data has been recently refurbished, and you're trying to obtain a longitudinal view, and you can only look back a couple of years. So all of those types of elements are very important for us to actually construct the economic models that forecast the impact, and to bring in David's team to actually invest in the product. And then the other really important thing, and I don't think enough time is spent on this, is that you need a super savvy entrepreneurial service provider who is willing to bet the house on their intervention. A lot of these investments, in my opinion, start to look a lot like VC investments. You're taking a chance on a social entrepreneur who says that they have what it takes to produce impact, the type of impact that would save a government money. For that to actually occur over a long period of time, you need to have a management team that feels comfortable with the risk that they're taking on, because they're taking on enormous reputational risk. If their intervention doesn't work, they're going to have a statistically significant evaluation that proves that. So that's a really crucial piece. And then I think to the second question, in terms of what's necessary to make these happen, Ryan, I totally agree. The federal government needs to get more involved. An interesting sign was that the White House in fall of 2014 finally committed $11 million, which is not a lot for them, but $11 million to really start accelerating the development of pay for success across the country. They bifurcated that into capital that is used to create what's called feasibility assessments for government, so working with governments to understand where they can build a social impact bond or a performance solution. And then they also allocated money to accelerate the deals that are currently close in development. So that's deals in Utah, California, Illinois, New York State, Colorado, et cetera. Without the federal government, I don't think that it's going to take us time to really get to where the United Kingdom is, which currently has over 15 deals constructed, while we here in these states have only 7. The other piece, I think, is standardization. And Peter, I'm sure you'll talk about this in the legalistic side of this, but what's tricky about this when you take this across the country to different investors, different providers, and different government and payers, is that people don't know the language about how to talk about this. And so when they're reading contracts, it's difficult for them to understand their risk. When they are signing up for their committees, it's difficult for them to think about who in the community should be at the table. And until we really start to standardize the language with which we talk about what this is, because there still are a lot of misnomers floating around, it's difficult for us to scale this. And then the last thing I'd say is that we need to start thinking about sustainably financing these projects. If you look at the guts of the projects that have been put together, the first 7, you'll see that they're very expensive. They have a high proportion of project costs versus the actual investment. Sometimes they don't even have that, or that's actually misleading, because so many of the costs have been either provided pro bono in these early stage deals, or have been just, people have lost money on it. So we're also thinking a lot about how to critically start to create what we think about as construction loans to actually sustainably pay for all of the working multi-stakeholders to actually be at the table for the long time that it takes to construct these, and make sure that they don't lose their hats on the transaction.
Thank you very much, Leah. David, how come there aren't investors lining up to do these transactions? It seems like Goldman Sachs is about the only one who's stepped up to the line.
Right. Thank you. Great question. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for having us. So I sit in a group at Goldman Sachs called the Urban Investment Group. And when people hear of social impact bonds and then hear Goldman Sachs, it's not immediately evident why we're involved in the space. And so just taking a step back to give you a sense of where we sit and where I sit within the firm more broadly, the Urban Investment Group was formed about 14 years ago and is really the firm's double bottom line and impact investing arm. So we invest principal capital from our Goldman Sachs balance sheet as well as a fund that we've raised over the last couple of years, which allows our clients and both institutional and individual to invest alongside us. And so this group's been around for almost, like I said, almost 15 years. And when Goldman became a bank in 2008, we also took on the firm's Community Reinvestment Act obligation. And so now we're both the CRA arm of the bank as well as just the impact investing and double bottom line arm. And the sort of principles that we guide our business by are seeking out investments that generate both a financial return, but also that have a real measurable social impact. And I think that more broadly, it's really evident that when you are able to leverage the capital markets and leverage private sector capital, you can really have a huge impact, whether it's on social services or whether it's on expanding affordable housing or building charter schools or financing community health centers. And so our whole mission, our whole goal every day is to figure out ways to leverage the capital markets and leverage the capital that we have access to in order to sort of scale some of these projects. And so about 4 years ago, we got involved in these crazy social impact bond structures. And I remember the day of the meeting when we were all sitting in a room being like, what should we call these? Social impact bonds, social impact not a bond, social impact financing. Every synonym for social impact and bond was on a whiteboard in one of the rooms in 200 West Street where our office is. We eventually settled on social impact loans, and that's what we try to refer to them as internally, for a number of reasons, but mainly because we really see these as simply working capital loans to intermediaries that eventually end up at service providers, and these service providers will leverage this capital to expand their services. So all we're doing at the end of the day is lending against the outcomes that a service provider is promising to deliver at the end of the day. And there are a number of unique challenges that both Lee and Ryan have spoken to, but I think that our role is actually relatively simple, right? So if you look up at the chart, there are a lot of arrows, but everything really does flow through the sort of central intermediary and central project manager. And our role, we typically only enter into one loan agreement and then a number of other agreements that, I know I'm supposed to read, Peter, but I generally skim, that go alongside the loan agreement with the service providers. And so I think that this business sort of fits broadly within what we try to do as a firm because we are able to really scale and grow projects and social services by providing sort of the upfront capital. But at the end of the day, it is early, right? And so there have only been 7 transactions done. We've worked on 4 of the 7 transactions and provided capital for the 7 transactions. One here in New York City, one in Massachusetts, one in Chicago, and one in Salt Lake in Utah. And each of these interventions, they have a lot of things in common. They have a lot of things that are very different among all the transactions. But I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to, in my opinion, 2 things: a incredibly sophisticated and visionary public sector that is willing to come to the table and think about new ways of financing their social services. And then second, a incredibly strong service provider that has the ability to sort of, like Leah said, both bet the house on their intervention and on their on the services that they provide, but also that is sophisticated enough to enter into these contracts and to really leverage this sort of capital. And so we found that has been there. I think so. To answer your question, the long-winded way of answering your question, Peter, I think the reason that there aren't investors lining up is because there aren't that many, both governments and service providers, that are just ready to structure these transactions, right? And so in a lot of the deals that we've been a part of, we've actually come in at different stages, but generally it's pretty early, and we are at the table with the government, with the service provider, with their intermediary, and really work to structure the transactions from, in some cases, day one, or even before day one. And in other cases, folks are at the table and we sort of give our feedback on the structures. But I think what's really important is to note that this is a new way of contracting for government. So one of the challenges that we faced is that government is used to working in a certain way, right? And generally it will move slowly, and even if it's sophisticated and interested in being innovative, just because of the controls that are in place, rightfully so, a single executive often can't just decide to do something, right? For better or for worse, they often don't have that authority, and so we've really been lucky in each of the deals that we've done to have very innovative thinkers that have been at the table and that have wanted to make these structures work. So I think that's sort of that is sort of key. And then second, going back to the service provider, I think scalability is extremely important. So what makes a good SIB project, a social impact bond project? I think it's scalability and a proven intervention alongside a willing public sector. So scalability in the sense that you can't, these structures are already complicated enough, and so you can't introduce an unproven intervention into this already relatively complex mix of entities and individuals and organizations. And so what we really try to do is find service providers that are already capable at a certain scale and use this capital to really expand their reach more broadly. And that's what we've tried to do in each of our transactions to date. So it's not like, so I agree that it's very venture-like in many ways, but in other ways, they're proven organizations that have just been working at a smaller scale. And then on the public sector side, I think government needs to look at these structures as ways to tap into new capital, but not free money. I think one of the challenges when we explain these is, government often says, oh, well, you mean if it doesn't work, we don't have to pay, right? So, why do we even need a contract? No one said that, luckily, but that's sort of what we're trying to shift away from and really structure these as binding contracts that if certain hurdles are met, someone is on the hook to make payments. Because at the end of the day, we have to make these investments, and we're underwriting the capacity of the service providers, but we're also underwriting the risk that the pay-for-success contracts come through on the contracting side. And then finally, what makes a good SIB project, I think, is the people at the table that are helping us structure the evaluations, obviously the legal contracts, oftentimes there are technical assistance providers that help sort of the intermediaries think about scale. And so there are a lot of extra costs that Leah alluded to, and each of these entities are extremely important, at least at the outset, to sort of grow the space. And then I'll just say finally that I think, why aren't there more SIB projects being done? I think the answer to that is what we've all been talking about. They're extremely complicated, they're relatively expensive, and there aren't a lot of people that have the capacity all in the right place, both in the public sector and the private sector and in the not-for-profit sector. And so finding that sort of perfect mix, it has proven to be harder than we have expected. But I think that on the evaluation side, and both Ryan and Leah talked about data and evaluations, and I think that from our perspective, we aren't necessarily, we aren't the ones that are picking the interventions. It's not Goldman Sachs' job to tell New York City to focus on recidivism and to tell Utah to focus on early childhood education, but rather we are there to provide capital for outcomes that the public sector determines are important enough to finance. And so from our perspective, whether the intervention that we're financing causes outcomes or not directly is less of a concern, right? So we're just looking at whether the outcomes will happen, and then I think there are other entities and there are other people whose jobs and whose priorities will mandate sort of a requirement to figure out what actually causes outcomes and lead to some of those more technical evaluations. But overall, it's a very exciting space, and we're looking to continue growing it. Hopefully next year there are 14 or 20 transactions we talked about. So,
David, give us just 2 seconds on your investment horizon and how that relates to the kind of intervention that will be able to harness your capital.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the investment horizon, that's actually one of the biggest challenges in these, is also that oftentimes to prove out savings, it takes a long time. And so our investments are, we typically have, for our fund, our investments have to be between 7 and 8 years generally. And on balance sheet, they're in that range, and sometimes even a little shorter. And so generally, I would say sort of 5 to 7 years is our sweet spot. And the challenge with that is you often don't see the outcomes and the savings in a lot of interventions until much later on. And so a common one is early education, for example. In early education, you pay for expansion of preschool, but oftentimes those savings really start to materialize 10, 15, even 20 years down the road, right? When you're decreasing teenage pregnancies, decreasing crime, increasing graduation rates, and high school graduation rates, and all of that happens on a much longer horizon. So one of our challenges, what we've really tried to work on, is finding early indicators of success that work within our investment horizon. And so whether that is performance on a standardized test in 3rd grade, or whether that's special education usage annually, those are the types of things that we try to really look at, so that we can condense that investment horizon. But it does limit the types of interventions you can in finance.
Great, thank you. So I'll do just a little bit on the subordinate debt position and legal questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience for this panel. But thank you guys very much. So the subordinate lender in this structure is a really important participant. When Leah is asked to set up a project management structure, very often her organization will form a special purpose subsidiary that's going to act as the borrower of the funds from the senior and subordinate lenders. And David, when he goes to his credit committee, is going to be asked, well, what's the borrower's debt to capitalization ratio? How much capital equity capital does the borrower have? And David may look at Leah's special purpose subsidiary and find that there isn't a lot of capital that's been put up for the borrower. So the subordinated lender is the one that counts as the equity capital in this structure. And in order to do that, that role has typically been filled by philanthropies, often family foundations, sometimes with famous names like Bloomberg. The family foundations have a specific interest in these kinds of activities because, of course, not only do they have a mission to fulfill these kinds of interventions, but they can undertake these investments through a mechanism called program-related investments. Private foundations have a mandate to disperse a certain percentage of their assets every year for charitable activities, and a program-related investment is the only kind of investment that they can make that counts toward that distribution requirement. The program-related investment has to meet certain very specific criteria. The primary purpose of the program-related investment has to be charitable in nature, and the production of income cannot be anything more than cannot be a significant purpose of the investment. That having been said, we all spend a lot of time working with these subordinated lenders who are focusing very much on making sure that if the program works, they will get paid because they want to recycle the proceeds of the investment into another charitable endeavor. So one test that sometimes is articulated for program-related investments for charities and their boards foundations and their boards trying to decide whether it's a proper PRI is there a for-profit investor out there who would make this investment? And is your investment a but-for investment? Would the social program not be able to happen if your PRI were not made? And in many social impact bonds or social impact loans, these tests are met, and the subordination of the philanthropic PRI is what supports the for-profit investors, the capital markets investors' ability to satisfy its underwriting criteria. So just a few selected legal issues that come up in these transactions. I can't resist giving you a few of those. Government is obviously a key participant. Many government agencies have limitations on the amount of debt that they can incur or the process they have to go through to incur debt. Is the pay-for-success contract a debt instrument for those purposes? That's a question that needs to be answered. Government is subject to procurement rules. Are these kinds of transactions, are they allowed to be sole sourced, or do they have to be competed? We have a sovereign involved. This isn't really a commercial activity. Do we have to worry about sovereign immunity? And probably the biggest one that Ryan mentioned, and everyone alluded to, is political risk, or what we would refer to as appropriation risk. The government agency and legislative bodies that are in place today have limited ability to bind the legislative bodies that will be in office in the future. And a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or a 7-year commitment by government is one that one has to ask, is the money that is committed to be, contractually committed to be paid, is it going to be appropriated in the future by future legislative and bodies and administrations? And we're now seeing some of the SIB projects that have been done are now coming into their second generation of elected officials. There's a new governor in Massachusetts, a new mayor in New York. Since the initial SIB projects were done, there was almost a new mayor in Chicago. And the willingness of government to continue to endorse these programs has been critical. And the state of Massachusetts, I think, was the leader in this area, because it actually authorized SIB investments by statute and provided that the SIB contract, pay for success obligations, would be full faith and credit obligations of the Commonwealth. So that was a very important and very innovative and I think productive step that was taken in Massachusetts, and I think we'd all hope that other governments will follow suit. There's some investor-related legal issues. These investments are structured as loans, but they don't have to be paid back if the social program doesn't work. Does that make them not loans? Does it make them something like equity investments? Some regulated institutions aren't allowed to make equity investments or have limits on their ability to do so. As I mentioned, satisfying underwriting criteria can be very challenging. Normally, when you make a loan, a borrower provides an indemnity to the lender, so that if the lender is sued as a result of the operation of the borrower's business, the lender will be protected. The organization in Leah's firm's position is not very enthusiastic about providing that indemnity, because they're involved as a charitable endeavor. They make fees to support their administrative activities, but they don't have a profit-making interest in the underlying endeavor, and so they are ill-equipped to provide, and not very anxious to provide, an indemnity. So building in to the transaction structure line items for insurance and having innovative insurance mechanisms that are going to be able to address some of these considerations is important. And if the program, God forbid, does not work and loans are actually forgiven, there has to be a contractual mechanism whereby the loans go away. And that's not a typical structure for David's credit committee to see, that the loan gets forgiven at some point down the road. The organization in Leah's firm's position is having a loan canceled. Well, that gives rise to cancellation of indebtedness income. That shouldn't be a problem for a not-for-profit, but what if it's unrelated business taxable income? Do we have to worry about that? Leah's organization is also in the position of borrowing money where interest accrues over time, and it may be several years before pay-for-success contracts start getting paid to pay back the interest. Those accruals and the booking of a loan on the balance sheet of the organization can make the organization's balance sheet not look so good, and their income statement. And we all know that even not-for-profits care a lot about how their financial statements look and how these instruments are booked and recorded, and how their participation looks to the outside world. So those are a few of the legal issues that we confront, and I think we'd love to have many questions for the panel from the audience. We really think this is is a terrific and innovative mechanism, and one that the more people know about it and are interested in the solution, the better off we are.
Thank you all for your presentation. My question is primarily for you, Peter, and then certainly the other panelists. But as legal counsel to one of the parties in this transaction, can you describe how different was the negotiation process given the underlying objective? I know this was a commercial loan, essentially, but was the negotiation process any different given the nature of this kind of deal? And then second, related to that, transactional costs are certainly a challenge, as you all alluded to. Should law firms at the early stages perhaps provide some kind of concessionary rates on their fees, either completely pro bono or so-called low bono, when they get involved in advising some of these parties?
Thank you. I think that the negotiation process and the documentation process for SIBs has a lot of similarities to many public-private partnership transactions and arrangements. Certainly the transactions need to fit into certain boxes for everyone's purposes. David's organization needs it to be a loan, and it needs to have an instrument documentation that looks like a loan. And the government needs to have its contract be contracts that fit into a government contract box. The not-for-profit intermediary needs to have contracts that fit its pattern and fit with its mission, because the not-for-profit has to carry out that mission. And so while there are a great many complexities, the basic elements of the legal documents are ones that would be familiar to any commercial lawyer. I will say that I think one of the best entertainment events during the SIB negotiations that I witnessed was when Ryan's boss, Professor Lehman from Harvard, who is the Dalai Lama of SIBs in the United States, was negotiating the measurement algorithms with David's boss, Andy Phillips, and it was sort of a Harvard Kennedy School love fest, and they were each trying to sort of, by the second paragraph, I was lost about what they were talking about. So documenting the measurement program and algorithms is very challenging, and that's probably the one that's, I think, is the most outside the box. As to transaction costs, in all these transactions, there were many contributions by a range of professionals in terms of fee concessions and pro bono work, and that clearly is important. When one represents the capital markets investor, of course, that's not a standard pro bono engagement to provide. It's not service to low-income individuals to represent Goldman Sachs. That's good and bad for me, but definitely professionals have to contribute. These are high transaction cost deals, and as Leah mentioned, we found that, surprise, once we get all the documents done and everything's closed, things change. And we often don't build into our budget additional costs for amending and updating and modifying documents. Maybe you guys might want to just address that briefly. We've seen that in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'd say, so a couple of things on the concessionary fees. In Utah, we hosted the first, to my knowledge, space-wide competitive procurement for legal representation. We received 6 RFP responses from local and national law firms, and the winner, Dorsey & Whitney, who's representing the programmatic manager in that deal, they're going to service about $255,000 worth of legal costs. $155K of that will be pro bono. And that was a great way for us to start to move the needle on asking law firms, hey, what can you afford? Instead of putting them into boxes like, we're not paying for anything, which was the first couple of deals. And in terms of the contingency costs, we're finally starting to build that into deals. The problem is that what we're learning about these savings is that some of them aren't as cushy margin as you would expect. And so increasingly we are seeing from government champions like Mayor Ben McAdams, who will start saying to you, it's not pay for savings, it's pay for success. And he is, I think, really leading the charge in getting government champions to think flexibly about what they're paying outcomes for. And that is very welcome to the pay for success community, because that is going to allow us to have more margin for contingency fees, especially long-term oriented ones.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I would just add that to Ryan's earlier point, scalability and growing the transactions overall will help this issue, right? Because when you have, our deals have been, the loans that we've provided have ranged from $5 to $10 million, and so when you're at that size, you know, the legal and evaluation and all those fees do make up a significant percentage of the total transaction, but I think at scale, there is obviously a perfectly linear growth with the fees and the size of the transaction, and so you'll really get some economies of scale, and I think that will help both the public sector justify some of that, because I think that's a big part of it, right? Sort of perception and being able to stand behind the deals, but also help organizations like third sector and like other intermediaries and also service providers look at doing more of these transactions.
The other big piece, if I may add, is that they're finally starting to be go-bys for these documents. The issue with the first couple of deals is that there weren't a lot of public documents, and actually, I still think most of the lending documents and all the 7 deals are not public documents. In our Massachusetts transaction, we really tried to advance that by putting our publicly available contracts on our website. And we have our contracts for our Cuyahoga deal on our website too. And that's been matched by other deals now. So you can see the Chicago deal publicly available. That is really advancing the ball on letting other government entities understand exactly what that looks like. And from a legal perspective, you finally can see how it was executed elsewhere.
When does it really make sense? I mean, you talked 5, 10 million, but you've been doing these deals now. What size deal would you say? If anybody's looking to get into this, how should they be thinking size-wise?
I think from our perspective, $10 to $15 million is when, for total deal costs, is when it starts to make sense. I think anything below $10 million for total deal costs doesn't really make sense for us, because if the deal is $10 million, then our piece of it is going to be much less, right? Because as Peter alluded to, there's subordinate capital, and there's other either quote-unquote equity from the service provider or otherwise that is funding the transaction. And so for our piece of the deal, 5 is the smallest that we have done and are looking to do going forward, I think. Never say never, but 5 is really the smallest, and I think above 15 or 20, you start to lose service providers that have the ability to deliver services at that scale. And so really, I think that's probably the range for us. But I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what everyone else is seeing.
I would say briefly, in addition to a dollar amount, there's also a number of people served scale that is important. For all these projects, we try to build in an evaluation component so that we know, did this program actually do anything? And to do that with any sort of statistical rigor, you need to have a sample size that is large enough so that you can distinguish between, oh, hey, look, the people that went through this program actually had substantially better outcomes than some comparison group of people that did not go through the program, versus saying, hey, we served 10 people with this and 5 of them had a good outcome, but maybe that's just random chance. So we think from our perspective, the sample size absolute minimum is probably like 100 people, but ideally you want to have a lot more than that.
There are a lot of arrows that rely on success, and what that seems to mean is that everyone is betting a lot on the service provider ultimately. And I wonder, well, if you're providing debt or equity directly to the service provider, you would build in governance or other control provisions in order to maintain alignment or have some teeth around decision-making and business activity. So it seems as if there's probably a service contract between the project manager and the program provider, how do you maintain alignment and control over what the program provider is doing over the life of the project? And secondly, could you give us a sense of if it is a complete disaster, where is the allocation of risk ultimately? Pretend $100 is lost. Government pays nobody. What is the sort of relative allocation of risk?
Leah, do you want to respond?
Sure. So it's an excellent question, and your insight is spot on. You're betting on the service provider, which is why I think, to David's point in terms of what he looks for in these deals, it's someone who's sophisticated enough to pull this off and has the data behind their intervention that you feel comfortable betting on them. In terms of the oversight there, so it's been done two ways. One is that there's a service provider just with the special purpose entity and the service provider. But what's come to become more popular and is something that we are trying to scale is a tripartite contract, is to align the government with the provider with the special purpose entity. And that is called the Pay for Success contract. Within that Pay for Success contract, you stipulate the services that need to be provided, the metrics that will be measured, the evaluation that will measure those metrics. Importantly, what are the project thresholds of failure that would be hit for the project to end early? That's not something we spend a ton of time talking about, but we spend a ton of time in deliberations thinking about what does a disaster picture look like, and how do we measure that early enough that we don't put good money after bad, and then how do we contract that? So that's also in the Pay for Success contract, and that's something that the academic evaluator is consciously reporting on a quarterly basis. The other piece is the drawdown schedule of loans, and this is where I think we hit to your second question of where is the risk concentrated? Really, the risk is concentrated with the investors, right? Because they're providing the upfront capital that the government's effectively borrowing until success is proven. But the way that you structure that upfront capital really starts to answer your question. So there have been a couple of ways to do that. We have put together basically what I consider tranched out debt products that have a senior lending position, a subordinate tranche, and then possibly even more credit enhancing tranche. And depending on the risk profile of the deal, we amend what the percentages of the total bucket looks like. So in a deal that I structured in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, that provider had actually never before implemented that combination of services before. The key service they had provided for a decade, and it's evidence-based, but there was a huge amount of risk of, gosh, if you build in additional therapies, could that take you off balance? As a result, we have of $4 million raised, the lion's share, 60% of that, is actually subordinated capital. And to further protect the senior investor, we're actually not drawing down on their capital until quarter 5 to allow for them an embedded pilot before and related conditions precedent on their loan. So everyone's well aware that the risk is with the investors. How you protect the investors and where that risk actually sits really depends on what the risk profile of the deal looks like, and that's something that we spend a ton of time on during the negotiation process.
That's a good answer. Any, maybe time for one more question? Paul, is that okay? One more? Yes, ma'am.
It seems to me you're trying to get a positive societal outcome, and you're trying to save government money. Those are the 2 points. Suppose that outcome is not dependent on one service provider, but it's actually some kind of larger group investment. Now, here's what I'm thinking about. If you know that neighborhoods are underperforming and that part of that reason is that they don't have a common place, a hub, a civic hub, to be able to obtain services and have a particular kind of experience to foster entrepreneurial activity or whatever, and you want to try to finance that facility, and you know that it will ultimately produce these wider benefits, but you won't be able to tie it to a service provider. Is this at all possible? David, Ryan's shaking his head.
So I would say yes. I think there's a few different ways that people think about how to contract for one of these, and an alternative way that you could think about this is instead of contracting with one service provider, you could contract with an intermediary who would be responsible for selecting the mixture of service providers that are out there that can deliver the ultimate outcome you want. So, you know, maybe you are trying to tackle an issue with the homeless population and you realize, you know, housing them, maybe there's one organization that houses them, but then there's another one that provides all the supportive services they actually need. You know, each one of them by themselves can't get the job done, but if you have one entity that is responsible for saying, we're gonna house these people and make sure that they have better employment and better health and whatever life outcomes, they can then go out and pick the people they wanna work with. It's definitely doable. Some of the projects that are in development are actually doing flavors of that. So I think that's the direction this field is definitely going in.
I'd also add, there's been a lot of, so we're working in Utah where we're faced with this exact question. There's a lot, so Utah has already launched a pay for success transaction, actually with Goldman as the lead investor, where they launched an early education project. There's a lot of work being done in Utah around collective impact. And folks are trying to figure out how do you intermesh your collective impact model with pay for success, which I think is underpinning your question. And then also how do you think about that with just facility development? And that's something we're thinking a lot about. So could you pair a pay for success contract with a municipal bond? Because part of it maybe you truly just need an extra prison or you really just need another shelter. It's not about the supportive services. The supportive services will come if you build the building. So that's part of our feasibility assessment is to say, you know, is pay for success the answer here? Is what exactly is your issue? And what's your outcome? And then what problems need to be solved to address your outcome? And sometimes it really is building a prison. And so you can think about how to create, how to finance that. And would the government want to finance that through a regular affordable housing investment, through a community development financial institution? Or would they want to actually fold that into a pay for success contract? I think we're just at the turning point of trying to answer that, and it's exciting that we're finally borrowing, you know, age-old concepts and age-old financing instruments and mixing them with these new innovative ones.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you, panel, and thank you, everyone, for attending.
And thank you, Peter, and all of the panelists. I think that last comment is really a great place to end because this is extremely exciting, inventive, entrepreneurial on the part of every seat around the table. And on behalf of my faculty colleagues that I see in the room, I suspect that, Peter, some of the legal issues that you summarized, which generated some perhaps nervous smiles from the other panelists, will be things that they either are addressing or can be addressing in their classes in this area. So thank you, audience, and thank you, panelists.